Welcome to another episode of Logic Made Lucid with Dr. Jacob Waldmeyer. In the previous two episodes, we looked at probability and statistics, which kind of go hand in hand. But now we're going to look at a topic that deploys both of those methods, but also in the context of experimentation and observation and more careful examination of what we can see and how we might theorize about the world around us. With scientific and hypothetical reasoning, what we are actually doing is we are addressing situations where inductive and deductive logic, which we had spent a lot of time talking about before, do not produce a strong conclusion. And when that happens, we need to form a hypothesis, right? We need to form a kind of supposition, which is based on the evidence, right? So what we know or what we can see, we might not be able to arrive at a strong inductive argument. We might not be able to arrive at a valid deductive argument, but so we'll suppose something, right? This has been called abductive reasoning, right? So inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, abductive reasoning is hypothetical reasoning. And so just a little bit on definitions. A thesis is an argument that supports or opposes some proposition, right? Generally, when we say we talk about my thesis, we're talking about some kind of argument that we're making. A hypothesis or a hypothesis is a tentative theory that requires further information. A hypothesis needs more information in order to confirm or refute itself. Right? It is a supposition in need of evidence. That's what a hypothesis is. That's what we're talking about here. The scientific method is the surest path we have to ascertaining what is real. And it really could be boiled down more or less to 4 steps. And depending on what kind of question you're asking, the steps may be a little bit different, but basically these are the steps, right? First of all, we identify a problem or a question, and then we form a hypothesis, which is an educated guess, right? It's a supposition. Suppose this is the case. Then we might analyze the hypothesis. We might say, well, if this is the case, then what should we see, right? We'll use some kind of deduction there. And then we'll, of course, test the hypothesis using these implications. This is the experimental part, or the observational part, depending on whether you are able to run an experiment or whether you're simply observing very carefully, say, the stars in the sky, or you're doing some sort of field research. Notice the scientific method deploys all the forms of logic that we had discussed. It combines deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning. Right? The way it does that, forming a hypothesis is an abductive process of reasoning. We are saying, well, maybe this is the case. Maybe this explains what we are seeing. Right? And then when we analyze its implications, we're using a little bit of deduction. We're trying to figure out whether any possible experiment we might form would be valid. Right? Is it actually going to tell us what we want to know, in a sense? And of course, when we test it, we are using inductive reasoning. We are gathering data. We are gathering evidence, right? So you might notice that science, because ultimately it is inductive, we rarely talk about proof when we're talking about the scientific method. It's more a matter of accumulating evidence, right? And then approaching some level of certainty, right? But as with all inductive arguments, you never quite arrive at perfect certainty, but you certainly can arrive at a very, very, very strong argument depending on how strong and consistent your data are. The scientific method deploys reason and observation in pursuit of the unknown. This is one way we can think about it. We can encapsulate the idea of the scientific method. When we are doing this, here's an example of the scientific method. We might ask, is 1 second of time the same in all cases, right? This is something that people had been wondering a little bit more than a century ago, whether there is anything like time dilation, right? Is time uniform across the entire universe, or does time vary, right? So we might form a hypothesis. Suppose time varies or dilates according to speed. Those of you who are familiar with Einstein's theory of relativity will recognize this hypothesis. Suppose time dilates or varies according to speed. Right? This is the abduction. Right? This is well, maybe this might explain some of the things that we may be observing. All right, that's our hypothesis. All right, well, then we might use a little bit of deduction. If the hypothesis is true, in other words, if h, and h, we'll say h is the variable or the placeholder for our hypothesis. If it is true that time varies or dilates according to speed, then clocks at different speeds will measure time differently. Right? This is a way that that if the hypothesis is true, then this is what we can then deduce. Right? Okay, now to put that in a more kind of formal manner, this is something we'd used this symbolism in previous videos. This is basically saying if h, then a change in the speed of a clock will imply the change in the way that clock measures time, right? So h implies that a change in SC implies a change in TC, right? Is one way of thinking about it. Now we can use contraposition, and we can say that if it turns out that it's not the case that a change in speed results in a change in time measurements, then we can say that our hypothesis is false, right? If this is not the case, then our hypothesis was wrong. Science is regularly checking hypotheses for this and regularly disproving, correcting, modifying, and reinventing or reconstituting certain various ideas. This is part of the method. This is one of the reasons why peer review is so important and why other people repeat oftentimes experiments and observations that other scientists do, because there is lots of space for error, and we need to confirm and reconfirm, test and retest, observe and reobserve the same kinds of things in order to make sure that we are right. So this is really the fourth part. We measure the time at various speeds to determine whether it is actually the case that whenever we see a change in speed, we also see a change in time measurement, right? This is the experimental part. This is where we are testing the hypothesis. And again, everybody who does science needs to be prepared to discover that their hypothesis was wrong. This is why we can never really get too attached to our ideas in science, because we may very well find out that it was incorrect. There are lots of great episodes in the history of science where this has been the case. We can talk about the difference between theoretical and empirical hypotheses, right? So theoretical hypotheses are going to propose principles or rules or frameworks that model or coherently account for large amounts of data, right? So when we talk about a theory, these are some of the things that we mean. Music theory, although it's true that music theory isn't quite a scientific theory, it establishes rules that describe chords and intervals, music theory. The theory of relativity explains energy and time dilation. And notice here, we're not really so much talking about theories as guesses or tentative ways of thinking about things that might not have been confirmed. Rather, here we are talking about theory as in a general paradigm, right? Darwin's theory of evolution is another example. It explains a lot of data that we observe, right? So we're talking about frameworks here. We're talking about overall mappings of explanation that fit the data, right? Now, empirical hypotheses are proposing not necessarily rules or laws, but rather empirical hypotheses are proposing the existence of something, right? We think that this must exist in order to explain a certain phenomenon. So, and this is something that we should be able to observe. We should be able to detect and measure it, right? It might have a diameter, right? It might have some kind of frequency or so forth. Atomic theory is an example. It's supposed that matter is made of discrete, indivisible parts, right? That we could measure. We could detect these kinds of things. Phlogiston theory, if you're familiar with the history of science, people used to wonder whether fire is actually a thing, like a substance that is inside flammable things. And when you heat them up, then this substance gets released, and that's what fire is, right? Turns out that's not quite the case. But that was one of the theories. It was one of the empirical hypotheses that had been tested and ended up being proven false. Germ theory proposed the existence of microscopic organisms. This is another example of an empirical hypothesis. Which was again supposition about the existence of something, right? Okay, so we distinguish between theoretical hypotheses which result in rules and empirical hypotheses which result in instantiations. Now, I want to point out a little bit of a parallel, right? Before, when we were talking about inductive arguments and analogical arguments, you might remember that there were really two sorts of conclusions that we could draw. When we could draw an inductive conclusion that resulted in some kind of rule that described all of the data that we were looking at, or all of the samples that we were looking at, or all the examples, or our argument could result in just simply saying that the next example will follow the characteristics of the previous examples, right? That was the instantiation aspect, the analogical conclusion. So here also with scientific hypotheses, we can see that it may be the case that the result is some kind of rule or framework, or it may be the case that the result is some kind of confirmation that something exists. So as an example of a theoretical hypothesis that turned out to be accurate, you might be familiar. Early on, a long time ago, Ptolemy had mapped the heavens with the Earth at the center. This idea was geocentrism, the idea that there's the Earth at the middle, there's the moon and the other planets and so forth, and they all orbit the Earth. Right? Okay, the problem with that was that when we try to map those orbital paths, there was the idea that everything in the heavens needed to be circular, right? So everything is perfect when you're getting to that level. So not only were the spheres perfect spheres in the sky, but also the orbital paths needed to be circular, right? There were these ideas about how things orbit. The difficulty was that when you put the Earth at the center, you end up with a lot of cycles and epicycles, and it becomes very clumsy and awkward and very complicated to try to explain how things orbit when the Earth is at the center, right? It's very difficult. And as you might imagine, you can imagine why that's the case, because what we now know that things are orbiting around the sun. Well, from the perspective of the Earth, we're trying to gauge all those orbits from the Earth's perspective, as if they all go around the Earth. We're going to end up with a lot of very awkward and messy pathways. So what Copernicus noticed a few centuries ago is that actually, you know what, if you put the sun at the middle, then these circular orbital paths, they actually align much more in a much more tidy fashion. And the math that we might do with them is much more efficient, right? So Copernicus noticed this, right? And this led to this suspicion that perhaps the sun is at the center, not the Earth. Perhaps heliocentrism is true, right? This is another theoretical hypothesis. Notice this doesn't necessarily suggest that there is an additional item that we could observe, but rather it's a different kind of mapping. It's a different framework for understanding our solar system. Well, our geosystem? No, our solar system, right? Okay, so that's an example of a theoretical hypothesis. An example of an empirical hypothesis is I want to share a recent case here. But in some cases, many observations of objects lead to hypotheses about additional objects, right? So yeah, the standard model of particle physics required for its completion the existence of a special type of particle that would account for mass. Now this particle had not been observed, right? We had not seen it, but so far all of the theory and all of the data lead to a strong suggestion that everything would be complete if there were this kind of particle that existed, right? And that's an abductive supposition, right? It's the idea that perhaps there is some kind of particle that exists. And people were calling it, they even were able to anticipate the properties of this particle, right? And sure enough, right, by 2012, what was called the Higgs boson was observed. And the world's most advanced particle accelerator was Large Hadron Collider at the European Center for Nuclear Research, or CERN. Right? Its properties were analytically confirmed also the following year after they crunched all the data. This particle had indeed been observed. So this is an example of an empirical hypothesis that was confirmed fairly recently. Now, one of the things that we might wonder when we're forming hypotheses, we might think about, well, are we using an empirical hypothesis or a theoretical hypothesis? And here's an instance that is very famous in the history of science, where people were unsure about whether they should form theoretical or empirical hypotheses. William Herschel first identified Uranus in 1781, and technically it was actually observed as early as 1690, but it wasn't recognized as a planet at that point. But then Herschel said, oh, this has all the features of a planet. The difficulty was that given the orbital paths of the other known planets, that they moved according to Newton's law of universal gravitation. It's an inverse square law involving the product of the masses of the two objects that you're using multiplied by a gravitational constant, right? So all the other planets seem to follow this path, but then Uranus, which was, the farthest one out we had observed, it wasn't quite moving that way, right? Uranus did not seem to conform to Newton's law of universal gravitation. So scientists or astronomers were at a crossroads, right? Either Newton was wrong, maybe Newton was wrong theoretically, and we needed to rethink the law of gravity. That's a possibility, right? That maybe the framework by which we were understanding the planets and their orbits is wrong. That's the theoretical possibility. Or perhaps there exists another planet somewhere out there that is perturbing the orbital path of Uranus. So perhaps there is another planet that we don't know about, that we have not yet seen, that explains why Uranus's path is so unusual in these ways. That's an empirical hypothesis because it suggests that there exists something else that is detectable and measurable given the right instruments. Okay. Well, what do we find? Sure enough, it turns out that there existed another planet that was perturbing the gravitation of Uranus, right? And that was Neptune, right? Neptune was discovered shortly afterwards. And again, this is another case where Neptune sort of had been observed. It was realized before, but had never really been recognized as another planet. So finally, Neptune was discovered, and that did explain why the orbital path of Uranus was off. So everybody's relieved. We can keep the general theoretical understanding of Newton's law of universal gravitation and say, oh, look, and that led to the discovery of another planet. When we think about, empirical versus theoretical, this illustration is maybe a bit of a reminder or a bit of an indication that theory and observation, they inform and influence one another. They oftentimes, arise together. They oftentimes figure together in scientific progress. So the difference between a theoretical and empirical hypothesis, it can be sort of understood on a spectrum or a scale, right? So it's almost like one's at one end, a theoretical or empirical hypothesis might be at one end, theoretical might be on another. The difference between these hypotheses is more a difference in degree rather than in kind, right? They exist on a spectrum. All right, now, will we take any sort of hypothesis, right? In the next episode, we will talk a little bit more about, people making guesses or about superstition and things like that. There is a way to determine which hypotheses are worth considering and that are more viable and more credible, and which hypotheses might not be worth entertaining or worth dedicating a lot of time and experimentation and money and resources to. Some hypotheses might just sort of be off the wall, irrational or non-evidence-based hypotheses. Other hypotheses may actually be quite plausible. How do we distinguish between the two? All right, and there are really 4 criteria. One of them is adequacy. So we ask, does the hypothesis fit or align with the empirical data that we have, right? Another question we ask is coherence. Does the hypothesis, is it logically or internally consistent, right? Or does the hypothesis contradict itself in some ways, right? We want to check for contradictions in our hypothesis, right? In our educated guess. Also, something else we want to look for is concordance. And here we're asking, does the hypothesis align with other confirmed models, right? So again, adequacy, does it align with what we know and what we see? Is it coherent? In other words, is it free of contradictions internally? Is there concordance between it and other models? And finally, fertility. Does the hypothesis lead to further useful knowledge, right? Is it useful? Is it fruitful? Is it something that's going to be productive as we move forward in our observations, in our testing, and so forth, in our theorizations or in our hypothesization? All right, another way of thinking about this, conveniently, this can be thought of this way. I sort of came up with this: 3 fits and a fruit, right? So when we're checking for whether a hypothesis is credible, we can say, is there an empirical fit? Does it align with known facts? Is there an internal fit? Does it align with itself? Is there an external fit? Does it align with other fields? And is there fruit? Does it enable progress? Right? So 3 fits and a fruit: empirical fit, internal fit, external fit, and fruit. If that helps you remember these different criteria for a viable hypothesis, awesome. If not, don't worry about it. So an example of a hypothesis that might not be very fruitful, that might not have many fits, is this one. And every once in a while, I hear people speculating about this. Because when we think about atoms, or when we learn about atoms, we find that well, they've got this. There's a nucleus, and then there's these electrons that are sort of orbiting the nucleus. In fact, we even call those orbitals, right? So, hey, the planets also orbit around the sun, and the model seems to appear as though it's like atoms are tiny solar systems, right? I actually had a relative call me one time out of the blue asking what the element that had the atomic number 9 was, right? 9 electrons, because at the time we thought that there were sort of 9 planets, or we classified them as such. And so my relative who called me up was curious about whether our solar system is really just a giant atom, right? And in this case, a fluorine atom, right? Okay, so that could be a hypothesis, right? Atoms are tiny solar systems, right? Well, we want to check for adequacy. Does the hypothesis fit or align with the empirical data that we have? Well, electrons, so if we want to just draw, there are lots of ways in which the hypothesis does not fit in this case. Just one of those is the reality that electrons all have exactly the same mass. Right? This is one of the things that we learn when we learn about particle physics and atomic theory. Electrons all have the same mass. They have identical mass. The planets, on the other hand, they all have different masses. Right? So that's a major difference, right? So it's not the hypothesis is not empirically adequate. It does not fit with the data that we have. Right? Okay, now so it fails that criterion, right? So far it's not really a viable hypothesis because it fails the first test. All right, well then we might also ask, well, what about coherence, right? Is the hypothesis logically or internally consistent? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't really meet this criterion either. Here we're talking about whether atoms are tiny solar systems. Well, one solar system is made up of many atoms, right? And this is a whole versus parts kind of thing. Rarely do we ever see a situation where the whole behaves exactly the same way as its parts. I mean, we can think of lots of situations, right? Does a chair behave the way that wood does, right? Not exactly, right? So there's a discrepancy internally in terms of there's an inconsistency between when we're thinking about the whole versus when we're thinking about the parts. It doesn't quite work out logically this way. Okay, so it fails the internal coherence, the logical coherence test. How about the concordance test, right? Does the hypothesis align with other confirmed models, right? Other fields, right? Other ways of understanding the world. Well, this hypothesis that atoms are tiny solar systems, it contradicts astronomy, contradicts thermodynamics, it contradicts quantum mechanics. The more we learn about the behavior of electrons, the more we learn about heat transfer, the more we learn about space and gravitation, the more different we can see atoms are from tiny solar systems. So in other fields of inquiry, other fields of knowledge, certainly the hypothesis that atoms are tiny solar systems does not fit with them. All right, fourth criterion, right? Fertility. All right, does the hypothesis lead to further useful knowledge? Well, the hypothesis that atoms are tiny solar systems, it doesn't really enable any progress in particle physics or space exploration. It's not really something that we're going to be able to get a whole lot out of. It doesn't show very much promise in that area. All right, so the hypothesis that atoms are tiny solar systems is not really a plausible, credible hypothesis. It's not really worth dedicating a whole lot of time and attention to. It's not really worth dedicating a whole lot of experimentation or resources to in this case, because it fails to meet all these criteria for a plausible hypothesis. Let's look at an example of a plausible hypothesis. And this one is the hypothesis that organisms adapt to their environments as they reproduce. Right? You'll notice that I named this hypothesis hypothesis E and you may recognize this because this is a very important hypothesis that is part of evolutionary theory. So we'll call it E. Okay, first of all, we look for adequacy. Once again, we're going to go through the same criteria. Does this hypothesis fit or align with the empirical data that we see? Well, we can observe that there are mutations over generations that improve adaptability, right? We can see these kinds of things. Now we notice this not just in the animal kingdom over long periods of time. Of course, granted, a human lifetime is not all that long, but we are able to observe change over time in plants and animals. Certainly, we look at the fossil record, and this is really not controversial. We know that mutations over generations can improve adaptability to certain environments. Right? All right, so it's empirically adequate. It passes this criterion. All right, let's look at the second criterion. Is it coherent? Right? Is the hypothesis logically or internally consistent? Or does it contradict itself? Are there internal contradictions to the theory? Well, we are aware that genes can change during reproduction. This is something that there's no contradiction there. Sometimes when DNA or RNA is copied, there's a little glitch or a little error in that copy, and that is a mutation. It's a change in a gene in some cases. Also, we know that habitats constrain survival, right? There are some habitats where certain things are better or worse at surviving in, right? This is not anything that, there's no logical contradiction here, okay? So it passes the coherence test. How about the concordance test, right? Does it fit external models? Does the hypothesis align with other confirmed models? And here we can compare evolutionary theory to geology and to astronomy. This is actually one of the things that led early scientists like Darwin, well, not necessarily early, but modern scientists like Darwin, to speculate about many generations of living things. We were learning geologically is that the Earth is actually quite old. Right? The Earth may very well be, and turns out it is millions and millions of years old, actually, billions of years old. So the geological time and astronomical timelines, right? So this is another thing that we have observed a little bit later, not necessarily when evolutionary theory was first being formed, but rather later on we could estimate with some level of precision how old the universe itself is, right? Partially by looking at the redshift of stars and estimating how long ago the Big Bang occurred, and so forth, right? So evolution aligns with that. It's consistent with what we know from geology and from astronomy. Okay, so it passes the concordance test. Okay, and then fertility, right? We ask, does the hypothesis lead to further useful knowledge? And hypothesis E, evolution, enables progress in epidemiology, genetics, immunology, ecology, and so many other fields. Evolution has, and many biologists will point out that that without evolutionary theory, biology makes very little sense. Evolutionary theory allows us to look at all of the data that we have and to understand it sort of together under a general rubric or a model that explains why there is variation in species. In other words, that explains why, and how organisms adapt to their environments as they reproduce, which is our hypothesis. Right? So this hypothesis enables lots of progress. It passes the fertility test. Right? All right. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about something else. This is almost like a kind of an addendum that is valuable to recognize when we're thinking about science. There's something called the null hypothesis. When we are taking data, when we are experimenting, when we're considering whether a hypothesis is accurate, we also want to consider whether there is whether the correlation between the phenomena that we're measuring. Earlier, there was the example of speed and time dilation, whether time slows down as something goes faster, right? These kinds of things. Well, maybe when we correlate those two things, those two phenomena, maybe when we measure one thing and then we measure another thing, maybe the correlation is just a coincidence, right? Maybe there's not really anything. It just so happened that at that point when we were taking measurements, we just sort of happened upon some sort of coincidental relationship between them, but maybe it's really the illusion of a relationship. Perhaps there's no actual relationship between the two things that we are measuring or comparing. Right? In other words, perhaps the correlation between them is null, right? Perhaps there's no real correlation. This is the null hypothesis. It's a hypothesis that says the data we're collecting really don't show any real relationship. Right? It may appear that they're showing a relationship, but again, it's just a coincidence. There are some great websites there's one data scientist who made a website just sort of comparing some very unusual things that seem to correlate with one another, but actually they don't. But it almost looks like they do when you compare them to each other, right? Okay, none of those pass this test. All right, so we want to be aware of this hypothesis, right? This hypothesis that there's no correlation, right? Okay, now there is actually a statistic, there's a metric that enables us to define this, right? To actually put a number on this. And I would encourage you, if you want to kind of get your head around this, I would encourage you to view the previous two episodes that we did in Logic Made Lucid, because they go over probability and they go over statistics, and both of those kind of coalesce in the idea of a p-value, right? So p is the probability that the correlation we see is only a coincidence, right? And put another way, p is the probability that the null hypothesis is true. P is the probability that it was just a coincidence, right? That there's no real correlation. So oftentimes when in the scientific method, if we find that p, that probability, is less than 5%, right? If the probability that the null hypothesis is true is less than 5%, in other words, if the probability that it was just a coincidence is below 5%, then we can reasonably reject the null hypothesis. In other words, we can say, maybe it was not a coincidence. Maybe our data really do show some kind of correlation between the two phenomena that we are examining, that we're observing, that we're measuring. Okay? In other words, if p is less than 0.05, if p is less than 5%, we could be confident, right? Now we can't be certain. Remember what we said earlier, because this is an inductive argument and it's a statistical conclusion. So we are not certain. We don't have absolute certainty. We have confidence. So we can be confident the correlation was not just a coincidence if p is less than 0.05. So I thought it would be valuable to go over the null hypothesis at the end of a discussion on science and hypothetical reasoning. And I hope this has been a very helpful overview for you of the scientific method and the process we undergo when we do science. And of course, in the next session of Logic Made Lucid, we are going to talk about superstition and pseudoscience, or the misuse of hypotheses, the misuse of abductive arguments, the misuse of impressions that we have about correlations between phenomena that can lead to significant errors in our reasoning and in our observation and in our overall understanding of the world. I'll see you then.